I have just finished a book. I believe I got it in one of my recent book hauls. I suspect from the 10 for $1 one, though YouTube apparently won't let me watch my video of that at the moment. So this is Swans Wings by Ursula Synge. Look at that cover. Never judge a book by its cover, as if any of us classic sci-fi and fantasy people have ever been able to do that, or indeed have ever tried. No, I don't think so. The cover is so much part of it. The artwork is so much part of the whole thing. This is a weird kind of book. Why did I get it? If you look at the cover, you've got a clear reference to the Hans Christian Andersen The 12 Swans story, in the guy who's kneeling in, I'm going to call it high medieval garb with one wing. The figure on the horse reminded me very much of Tuatha De Danann, La Belle Dame Saint Mercy type vibe. The back, I wouldn't have bought it for a lot of money because the back description is not well written, and I might as well read this out. The Countess Elmira was not a witch, but she ruled the city with a firm hand and a cold heart. And the songs that praised her icy beauty claimed that even the snow fell at her command. She had an appetite for wonders and marvels, for oddities and freaks of nature, so when her gaze fell upon Lothar, the handsome, desperate young lord with a swan's wing in the place of one arm, she immediately wanted him for her own. Lothar's heart turned numb under her cold gaze, and he forgot his companions, his quest, forgot anything but the white beauty of the Countess, and a new song went around the streets and bawdy houses of the city, and I'm not going to sing it because, you can guess what sort of thing it'll be, can't you? Why would I have got it? So, fairy tales and fairy tale retellings are my jam, and I might link below the review I did on the Jungian analysis of fairy tales. And if I had have looked up the author, which I'm not sure that I actually did, there would have been more reasons. So Ursula Synge is an interesting character. She was born in the early 1930s, maybe even 1930. But in 1979, she went to do some sort of literature writing course, I think. And this, incidentally, was published in 1981. So it well might be her debut novel. It's certainly the first one she would have written after doing this writing or literature course. But if you look at her name online, most of the books that you see associated with her have to do with the Kalevala. Now, the Kalevala is an epic poetry of Finland. It was compiled by a wandering cleric, priest, teacher, I think it was a teacher, who went all around Finland and the Karelias and collected all these amazing fairy tales because he was afraid that they were all going to be lost to Christianity. The Kalevala is the most beautiful epic poetry that I've ever seen. I will stop raving about it in a second. But I would have thought that any author who mostly wrote about the Kalevala would have been complete my cup of tea. Ursula herself is British, I'm pretty sure. Yes, born in England. So for all those reasons I would have got it. Reading it was a very mixed experience, and I can't claim that I loved it. On the whole, I'd probably give it 2 stars out of 5, maybe 2.5. I didn't hate it. It was okay. Certain elements of it were kind of enjoyable, but it was odd. And what's even more odd is if you look on Goodreads, you will find, I think there's less than 10 reviews of it, and they're glowing. They're 4 and 5 stars, people raving about it. That might have contributed to me buying it. I can't make the reviews, I can't make it all mesh together in my head. I just really can't. I feel this book fails in a few ways. It might well, for a debut novel by someone who's interested in fairy tales and so forth, and who's trying to test out all the things I've just learned in a course, that kind of makes sense. But it's not quite fantasy, and it's not quite fiction, And it's certainly not magical realism, because magical realism was as a genre only invented in the last few years. It certainly wasn't around in 81. Mythic fiction, retelling of fairy tales, it isn't really any of these things. Now, each one of those is a classification, if not its own genre. And this falls in between all of them in a sort of mangled way. So, the first thing that kind of put me off when I was reading it, not a huge book, there's only 152 pages in total, but the first 40, which is nearly a third of the book, or quarter? The first 40 have got nothing to do with anything that you think you're reading about. They're not a fairy tale. They are very nicely written. The book throughout is very nicely written. It's just the plot, or this, it's not even a plot. The sequencing of events is what lets it down. So the first 40 pages are about some dude. He was found, Matthew, his name is. He was found in the woods by some village guy and brought home to the village, and they decided that he was the devil's son because he was found on Christmas Eve, or I don't know, something like that. And no one really wanted him there, but the priest convinced the village to give him charity, so he grew up being kind of abused and thrown around and stuff. And then he spends a lot of time in the woods, because in the woods no one throws stones at him and so forth. He watches the animals, he starts carving them, and that leads to the priest discovering that he's beautiful carver and taking him under his wing in the church, and then as the priest gets old, finding him an apprenticeship in another town. He grows up to be a stonemason, a carver of beautiful statues, mostly for churches, because this is unremittingly Christian. There's God and churches and bishops and priests, and it's the level of godding in it is historical rather than anything else. So is it historical fiction? Not really, not quite, but the way the Masons are described as working under the priests is historical accuracy, really, because Masons did. Most of the art that has come to us out of the medievals in Europe and England was to do with religious stuff, because that was almost the only people who could afford a lot of it, and that was the only ones who survived wars. So, but while it's prettily written, it's very odd to understand why a quarter of this very narrow book is just about some random dude. And at the end of that, Matthew's this well-known carver. He seems to be a bit, I don't know, bipolar. He goes from being really happy and productive and carving and loving what he's doing to getting all morose because he can't make his statues really come to life and, I don't know, fly away or leave the pedestal or something. Goes from town to town. He meets a goose girl that he really likes. He carves her. It's like, what is happening here? We don't have strong enough characterization for Matthew, is it? Matthew? Michael? Matthew. We don't have a strong enough characterization for Matthew to be a sympathetic protagonist for us to want to follow him, or even for him to feel all that real. He doesn't feel all that real. Anyway, so finally on page 43, he's wandering around being bipolar about how he can't carve things, and then he looks down to the street and he sees some guy's cloak unravels and there's a wing underneath it, so he follows this guy. The guy is Lord Lothar, and he's wandering around, and he tells our Matthew the story of how he came to have a wing, and it's basically Hans Christian Andersen's The 12 Swans, or The Wild Swans, a version of. I felt like this is where the story actually begins, but the complete telling of Lothar to Matthew of how this happened is like a page or two. No, it's less than a page. It's a few paragraphs and less than a page. And then we're done. And I'm all Is this it? Is that all the connection that I get to fairy tale after this cover and this book and reading this much? I wasn't impressed. Next thing that happens is Lothar's wandering around, and this goose girl, who happens to be a goose girl called Gerda, who Matthew had previously, by complete coincidence, stopped by her well to drink water, and she's got a pretty nice gander. She had geese and a gander. So that's, I suppose, is meant to be a nod to the Goose Girl stories, and that's a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. But this is not a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, and this is not the Goose Girl, and this is not the 12 Swans either. It keeps getting snippets of this tale and that tale, but it's not a fairy tale. In no way is this a fairy tale experience, because fairy tales have certain underlying attachments to humans and psyches, and sometimes they're social based. It's like, I know Jungians would argue that Hans Christian Andersen wrote tales but not fairy tales because his was so heavily based in society. I think they qualify as fairy tales, but this isn't. This is just a fantasy story. And anyway, so we've got these three mismatched people, none of whom really stand out as characters. Lord, what's his name? Lord Lothar especially barely qualifies as human. He doesn't really seem to have much of an emotional life. And what little we see of him, you can't really care about him very much. He doesn't really care about anyone else. Gerda kind of worships him. He's beautiful, and she's fallen in love with him or whatever. Matthew worships his wing, which has a beauty that he sees as an artist and wants in his carving. The three of them just wander off down the road for the next, I don't know. And it makes no sense. It feels like it should be a quest. A quest being a significance-laden journey, whether it's in mythic fantasy or fairy tales or in epic fantasy or just plain fiction. Whatever it's in, a quest is a thing. It's a specific journey. Sometimes it'll have a specific mission, or sometimes there is a goal in the journeying. It can be symbolic or allegorical. In literature, it will often require great exertion. What else do you get with questing? Oh, you get those quests to adulthood. There's a specific word for that. I can't remember what it is. Anyway. But while these guys wandering randomly around the countryside has got elements of all of these, it never really materializes as any. The thing with significance-laden quests in fairy tales is that things occur that are landmarks to what's happening. And some of these things seem to occur here, but they don't happen in a way that has any meaning. So Gerda has her gander with her. She left the geese behind. She was that in love with this pretty face of this mopey emo Lothar that she left her animals behind her. It's like, I really didn't like Gerda. It's like she wasn't a very real human, so you can't really like or dislike, I suppose, what's basically a cardboard cutout more than a stereotypical. She was a bit stereotypical girl in love, but there just wasn't much of anything to Gerda, and she abandoned her animals. Not on board with that. Not on board. But her gander stayed by her. The gander has got a better sense of morality than his goose girl. And they're wandering down the road together. The gander is almost the magical animal that in fairy tales is significant. And he has a significant part in disenchanting Lothar. So he kind of is, but then he kind of isn't, because he's kind of a real creature. And then when he vanishes, we kind of forget about him instantly. The quest, no one really grows or changes or learns anything. And at the end of it, Lothar's no longer with them, but that almost seems incidental. None of the things... I mean... In this sort of a quest, you expect your hero or heroes to suffer great privation, and we're told that they do. They're beggars. You've got one of the top masons in the country, but he's a beggar on the road with these two, and there's no reason for it any time or anywhere. At some point, they actually come across the house that Lothar believes is the house in which he lived with his 11 brothers and his father when the wicked stepmother came along. And his sister? Oh yeah, there was a sister. She vanished too. And when they find this house, this place of great significance, of potential importance, of potential meaning and learning, they sort of go and like, oh, this is the house. And then they just keep on wandering down the road. It's just batshite. And it keeps happening. All the things just don't hold together. Anyway, so remember that fascinating description on the back about the Countess Almira, who at page 80 or whatever we had not heard of at all. She does finally materialise around about page 90. So this far into the book, more than half, this description on the back, none of that happens until more than half of the book's over. If the writing hadn't been so beautiful, there would have been nothing that could save this book. But the writing is quite beautiful, so the fact that it doesn't know what it is or what it's doing, essentially to an extent doesn't matter. There's small snippets in the writing though that I didn't love, and there's one pretty early on when Matthews joined Gerda and Lothar in their meaningless beggarly wanderings down the road, where there's this strange interplay between Gerda and Matthew, where she's saying, well, why did you stop carving these beautiful statues? And he's going, oh, well, a woman can never understand how a man really feels about his art. And I'm going, whoa, battle of the sexes, but this is written by a woman, so that's just weird, icky. What's she trying to do here? What's she trying to make? Is she trying to make Matthew more real as a man? Fail. Is it something else? It's too obscure for me to understand. Okay, so this strange women can't ever understand men, they're too shallow-brained to understand our complex artistry. And let's never forget that we never stray far from God. There's always churches and gods and angels and stuff. And maybe this is why this has such high ratings. Maybe this is being accepted by Christian fantasy or mythology readers, and that's what they love about it. I've never been that keen on the Christian gaudy stories at the best of times. Okay, so the historical part of the historic part of how the Christianity, however, works. If this had been trying to be a historical novel, in which it describes the relationship of Masons and churches and that sort of thing, good. Those parts were good. Probably better than the fairy tale attempts, to be honest. So then he's ensorcelled by this woman, and a lot more of nothing in particular happens. And then he's not ensorcelled by this woman, and so they wander down the road again. And at the end, Gerda breaks a walnut while they're wandering through a maze because she gave all her money to a beggar under the gate who gave her a walnut and some basic instructions. And when she does this, Lothar is supposed to find when she does this, she's supposed to find her heart's desire. Only because she's a real dumbass, her heart's desire is for Lothar to be turned into his true shape. A bit Shrek. Maybe the people who wrote Shrek had read this. True heart's desire, true form, whatever. So she breaks the walnut, and we've got a brief scene where Lothar turns into a man with a swan's wing, or a man with an arm, or a swan with that man's head. He goes through one of those blippity things that works very well in CGI. Actually, this wouldn't be a bad movie if it was heavy on the CGI. Probably a better movie than a book, to be honest. Look at that pretty cover. Such a pretty cover. I didn't love this book. 2.5 stars because the writing is beautiful, but 2 stars meh because it doesn't know what it's doing, and it really doesn't. If you want to retell a fairy tale, that's a tall order. Lots of people who are really good authors and really experienced fall down with this one. But trying to retell half a dozen fairy tales with no more than a sentence from each has not worked in this particular quest for the Swans Wing, or getting rid of the Swans Wing, or whatever on earth it is that this book thought it was doing. I'm sorry, Ursula. I may well make the effort of reading the Kalevala versions, though I might just go straight back to the Kalevala and reread that, because that is beautiful epic poetry. Don't know what was happening here exactly. Lovely prose. Lovely prose. Lovely cover. Not the best fantasy. Not the best fantasy book I've ever read. I'll probably remember the prose long after the details of the actual questy stuff vanish, because let's face it, the quest never really happens. Yeah, meandering book. Now, as a last request, if anyone has watched this video who is part of BookTube or just YouTube in general, and can in the comments explain to me why YouTube won't let me watch my own videos without watching ads, and keeps complaining about the ad blocker that I'm 90% certain I don't have, tips on handling YouTube would be vastly appreciated. Though, comments about this book, also good.